لطف میکنید.
شکر.
خب پاورپوینت هم داره آپلود میشه. آقای دکتر جلیلفر یک کمی واتساپ کنیم پاورپوینت هم آپلود شه.
اشکال نداره آقای دکتر. صدای منو دارین؟
بله بله صدای شما رو دارم
آقای دکتر. بله بله.
جان صدا خوب هست آقای دکتر؟
بله بله بسیار عالیه.
خیلی خوب.
خب بخواید من یه مقدمه بگم تا فایل شما هم که آپلود شد ظاهرا.
الان ساعت شما چند آقای دکتر؟
دقیقا ساعت 4.
ساعت شما چند الان اونجا؟
3:59. بله.
اگه اجازه بدید که فایلم کاملا آپلود بشه که خیالمون راحت باشه و بعد دیگه بتونیم.
بسیار عالیه.
عذرخواهی میکنم بین کلامتون من دوباره مزاحمتون
شدم.
دکتر ریاضی برای مثل اینکه شما فیلمی هم برای آپلود دارید، لطفا فیلم رو هم از قسمت شیر مای داکیومنت آپلود کنید و اجراش کنید.
نه دیگه فیلم ندارم، فقط همین وبکم رو میخواستم فعال کنم و پاورپوینت هم.
بسیار بنده در خدمتتون هستم.
خیلی ممنون خانم محمدی.
خواهش میکنم، لطف کردید سرکار خانم.
خواهش میکنم.
آقای دکتر اجازه میفرمایید؟
بله بسیار عالی. خوب. خواهش میکنم آقای دکتر، من در خدمت شما هستم.
خواهش میکنم. Good afternoon everybody and welcome to this session. Well, I should thank Professor Riazi in advance for accepting my invitation. I hope everybody is sound and safe in this new world with COVID-19, and I hope every one of us has got used to continue living well under this new circumstance. The universities have been shut down. Still, we seize this opportunity to benefit the virtual space and invite colleagues, keynote figures in the field with those people with academic recognition to share with us their experience and the recent trends in the profession. I am honored to introduce Professor Abdulmehdi Riazi from Macquarie University. Professor Riazi is emeritus professor from Shiraz University. Later he moved to Macquarie University and received his professorship there. Well, I guess he knows no introduction. He has published extensively in Iran and more particularly and auspiciously at international scale. The topic that Professor Riazi has chosen to present today is publishing papers in quality journals. This is one of those concerns that PhD holders, academic members, PhD students, MA students, this is the concern of all those people, and it sometimes, we get into trouble publishing at international scale, because you have to show that, you are making knowledge claims and the claims that you make are valid enough. I'm sure everybody enjoys Professor Riazi's presentation, because whenever I have been when listening to his presentations, he has always had something new to present to us. Professor Riazi, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I turn off my microphone so that you might be better heard.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jalalifar, for your introduction, and respectively, I wish all the participants in this webinar to be well anywhere that they are, and I wish you all the best. As Professor Jalalifar mentioned, the new circumstances and situation has given us some opportunities to connect perhaps somehow better by using the advantages of internet and the softwares that we can use. So it's my great pleasure to share with you some of the things that I think would be useful both to seasoned researchers as well as PhD students. Although my main audience would be PhD students, but I think sometimes I need to remind these things to myself as well, and so it might be useful to some other colleagues that who are probably listening to this webinar as well. The title of my webinar is How to Publish Papers in Quality Journals, and there were one thing that actually I would like to clarify at the very beginning of the webinar is a disclaimer, and I'm sure that you know this, and you do not expect to be able to publish papers just because of this webinar. But I need actually to clarify this point early in my presentation. As you know, publishing papers in journals, let alone publishing in quality journals, is not a skill to be developed or acquired in short term. It is a longitudinal process. It is an ongoing process and requires effort and perseverance. However, it's not actually something impossible. All we need to do is to get a plan and then work out our plan. So this webinar is not an ability injection, and I'm sure this is not you are expecting from the webinar. It is a process guideline. It is about developing a research and writing plan so that hopefully when you go through your plan, you would be able to publish in journals and then in quality journals over some years and after you acquire required experiences. And I hope that this webinar gives you some guidelines and ideas about how you might be able to plan the process for being able to publish in these journals. So the way that I have organized my webinar is that firstly, I would like to clarify to myself and to the audience of the webinar, what do we mean by quality journals? So that then we can consider them as our target, to publish in. And then I will shift to what does publishing in quality journals entail, and what are different types of journal publications, because when we talk about publishing in quality journals, it's not only full-length articles. There are other, types of journal publication that we need to consider, and they are worthwhile in addition to full-length articles. So I will be basically focusing on a publishing plan, which includes publishing book reviews, publishing review papers, converting a thesis into a paper, a journal article, and publishing short and long papers in Q4, Q3, Q2, and Q1 journals, which I will explain what is meant by these, types of journals. And then in the fourth section of today's webinar, I will talk about selecting journals. Firstly, I will give you an idea of the main salient journals that are available in our field and how we might select them appropriately in order to publish in there. And finally, I will concentrate on developing a research and writing plan, and hopefully we get some time for questions and answers, and I would be happy to accommodate your questions and your feedback on this webinar at the end. Okay, let's move on and see how journal quality is defined and what do we mean by quality journals. Currently, there are two indices that define journal quality. One is impact factor that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and the other one is journals quartile, which is defined in the form of Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and some journals actually are unranked in terms of quartile. So Q1 journals are those journals that are located in the top 25% of all the journals in a particular field. So if you go to some of the databases that I will introduce, you will see that usually we can get both the impact factor as well as the quartile of the journals. Q4 means those journals that are located in the bottom 25% or the last 25% of the journals when they are ranked according to their impact factor. And there are some journals that, of course, not ranked yet by those organizations that index the journals. So a journal's impact factor is based on how often articles published in that journal during the previous 2 years. For example, think about 2017 and 2018, and the articles that were cited by other papers, and then the total number of the citations over the last 2 years divided by the total number of articles will result in a number that we usually refer to as impact factor. So if I want to give you a simple example, if the total number of citations to the articles in a journal over 2017 and 2018 was 30, and the total number of articles published in that journal was 15, then 30 divided by 15 will result in 2, and therefore we refer to 2 as the impact factor of the journal. Obviously, the higher a journal's impact factor, the more frequently articles in that journal are cited by other researchers as they write, their articles. And the impact factor can therefore give an approximate indication of how prestigious a journal is in its field. In other words, the higher the impact factor, the more prestigious the journal would be considered. Although there are some controversies about impact factor, not all the researchers and scholars agree on impact factor as an index of quality for journals. However, and especially because these impact factors vary across disciplines. As we know, impact factors are very high in sciences and engineering, but they are not that high in social sciences and humanities. Despite these controversies, impact factor is still considered as an index by academic circles, and it is commonly used for different purposes to judge about the journal as well as to judge about individual researchers' performance as how they have been, publishing in the journals. So we need to consider impact factor, although we might be critical and we might criticize impact factor as an index of quality, but it seems that we need to handle it in our, dealing with the academia and our profession. The way that impact factor and quartile of journals are identified is by some organization, as I mentioned before. So, for example, Journal Citation Report, JCR, which belongs to Web of Science, and also SCImago or SJR, which was developed by an algorithm through Google PageRank, and this belongs to Scopus. So basically, in academia and where it is necessary to discuss and talk about journal quality in terms of impact factor and quartile rank, usually people refer to JCR and SGR. I should say that JCR is stricter than SJR in terms of journal quartile. In other words, if you compare the quartiles of journals in these two databases, you will see that usually SJR is more lenient with regard to journal quartile. In other words, some journals which are ranked as Q1 and Q2 might be ranked as Q3 in JCR. So there is no consensus between JCR and SGR in terms of the quartiles that they assign to the journals, because the algorithm that they use actually are different. However, these are two references that usually are used in academia in order to discuss and talk about journal quality. Okay, so now that we understand what is usually meant by quality journals, and as I mentioned, the people refer to impact factor and quartile of the journals in order to talk about the quality of the journals. We need to think about how to publish in quality journals and what publishing in quality journals entail. Number one, we need actually to be thoughtful about the fact that it's very competitive and tough, I should say, given the number of submissions. Because as we move on, the number of articles and papers submitted to journals, increases enormously. And therefore, given that each journal receives many articles, therefore, usually it's not easy to get published in quality journals. And because of the high number of articles that journal editors receive, they are usually looking for the least excuse to reject the papers on the spot. And usually one of the main excuses that they apply to the rejection of the papers is non-compliance with the guidelines. So it's very important to to consider the guides to the authors, and therefore make sure that we comply with the guidelines provided for the authors. For some journals, I can say that on-the-spot rejection, or what is also referred to as desk rejection, is 80%, as cited as documented by Highland in 2017. And even this might be more for some other journals, higher journals. And I have quoted this from Paltridge and Starfield. So you can see that even if the rejection rate is 80%, and please be reminded that this is desk rejection or on-the-spot rejection, which means non-compliance with the guidelines of the journal, is very high, and therefore there remains only 20% or somewhere between 5% to 20% of the articles that might go under, review, and then the decision is made by the editors whether they should be published in the journal or not. So the immediate implication that this has for us is that we always need to read the author guidelines very carefully and make sure that our paper is not rejected on the spot as a matter of non-compliance with the guidelines of the journal. Okay. Now, papers must be of high. Now, suppose that we actually pass the first, gate, which is compliance with the journal, guidelines. The next thing we need to consider is that we need to make sure that we are submitting a high caliber paper in terms of research and writing in order to get the chance of getting published. So the implication for this is that to get published in quality journals, we need to report a quality research in an effective way. And this requires perseverance. It needs goodwill and hard work. As I mentioned before, it's not something actually that we can do in short term. My main message in this webinar will be for you to plan for future and to go through some step and stages in order to get prepared for publishing in high quality journals. It's a process that needs patience and not to get disappointed, because certainly there are harsh feedback from the reviewers, as well as there are occasions of rejection, if I would not say actually high rate of rejection. So we need to be patient and do not get disappointed by rejection or more major revision decisions by the editors. Okay. So writing are two main elements of the journal articles. I would like to draw your attention to these two elements. The first one is research, which refers to the content of the papers. In other words, when you submit a paper to a journal, you're submitting some content, and this content originates from research. And the research needs to be reported in good writing, and therefore I would refer to this part of papers as presentation. So we need both the content, which is the research, as well as a good presentation, which is the writing of the paper. And if these two are available and gained in the paper, then you can make sure that your paper actually would be considered for publication, and there is a high chance of getting published. So research and writing are two main elements to focus on. And I can say that nowadays actually they are intertwined and reciprocal. In other words, good research lends itself to good writing, and good writing is required to report a good research. So both of them are very important. A paper in a quality journal needs to be of both good research and good writing, as I mentioned before. And therefore papers are rejected because of poor research and poor writing. So there is a very high chance of rejection, on the spot rejection or desk rejection, due to poor research and poor writing. So you can be sure that if you submit a paper with poor research and poor writing, there is no chance of getting through. Even there is no chance of getting through the review process, let alone to get published. If there is good research, you have conducted a very good research, but you have presented it with poor writing, it would actually be rejected by editors. So the first one would be rejected by editorial office. I mean, there are some staff in the journals who do assistance to the editors, and therefore, as soon as actually they look at the paper and they come to the conclusion that the paper does not comply with the guidelines of the journal's publication, then they reject it. Even if the paper goes through that stage, but still there are poor writing, then the editors actually might decide to reject it before they send it to review. Poor research but well-written papers. So there might be some scenarios in which a poor research has been conducted, but it has been very well written, maybe in collaboration with a more experienced writer. But again, we need to make sure that this paper will be rejected this time by reviewers, because they will come up with the decision that it does not have significant contribution to the field. So all in all, for a paper to get the chance of go under review as well as getting published, it needs to have a quality research and quality writing. And as I mentioned before, these two are intertwined. So the first tip that I have for you is to get the chance of getting published, a paper needs to report a strong research project. Please be reminded that a strong research does not necessarily mean complex and complicated, because it's my observation that sometimes PhD students think that their thesis is a Nobel Prize, and they think that they need to solve all the word problems by a PhD thesis project. This is not the case. So never equate a strong and quality research with complicated and complex research. What I mean by a strong research is that it needs to be sound research with potential contribution. You might have come across some simple research that has got published in journals and you might get surprised. It's because they have a point to make, something that they can contribute to the field. So the first implication, the first tip actually is that you need to conduct, plan, design, and conduct a good research that has potential for contribution to the field. And the other tip is that be well presented. The paper needs to be well presented and well written. So the points that you are making and the arguments that you are making should be clear. Please be reminded that any paper or any piece of knowledge is a knowledge argument or a knowledge proposition. And therefore, you are going to make a point by arguing for that point and communicating your findings with other readers, and in the first place with the editors of the journal and later on with the reviewers of the journal. And therefore it should be well presented with adequate evidence. I think this question is very useful to ask ourselves all the time. What does this paper contribute to the field? So before others ask you this question, it's very useful if you ask yourself this question. And if you are able to answer this question, how your paper contributes to the field, then I'm sure that this will help you in order to organize your arguments and structure your paper in a way that can attract attention from the editors as well as from the reviewers. So I can tell you that you need to create your own luck and opportunity. Don't wait for others, or don't blame others. Because sometimes when our papers actually get rejected, we immediately jump on and blame other people, and in particular editors and reviewers, for not allowing the paper to go through. But no, it's you who should create the luck and the opportunity, and not others. And the implication of this is that you should have something important to contribute and to publish. you need to have a passion to contribute to the current body of knowledge of the field. And this starts from choosing the topic, the questions, and designing and conducting, your research. Especially now I'm targeting, PhD students and early career researchers. Make sure that you invest your time and resources wisely. Please be reminded that goals are achievable if you have a good plan ahead of you. And since you will be spending 4 or 5 years doing your PhD, so it's your life and it's your time, and you will spend a lot of resources. So you need to invest your time and resources wisely by planning well and investing well in the work so that you can get a good outcome from your work. Okay, so let's move to the third point of today's presentation, and that's developing a publishing plan, and therefore targeting what to publish at what time. These are my experiences, and also I recommend that you look through them and therefore plan your 3 to 5 year publishing plan by starting with book reviews. I will say that book reviews are very important because they are not as challenging and difficult as full-length articles, but at the same time you can gain a lot, and it would be very rewarding when you have your book reviews published in the journals. Once you publish some book reviews, then you are in a good position to publish review papers. Review papers are either standalone or from the literature review chapter of your thesis, because you devote a whole chapter in the thesis to the literature review. Therefore, there is enough content and material in that chapter to help you either to write a state-of-the-art paper, if it is well grounded, or at least to prepare a review paper that you can publish in some journals. And then you move on to short reports from the project of your thesis, and then hopefully with full-length papers, basically, and firstly from your thesis, and then from thereafter from the research that you conduct, and therefore you can get used to how to write and publish in the papers. Each of the above items has its own structure and genre. It's very important to develop some metacognition about the structure and genre of these types of publications, and you need to acquaint yourself with the required structure and genre of any of these publications in order to get appropriate type of papers that you can publish in the journals. So this brings me to the second tip, and then the second tip is start with reviews. There are two types of reviews. One is book review and the other one is review paper. You need to be realistic. I mean, none of the professional, authors and researchers, and none of the established figures in our field or in other fields have started with big and full-length articles. They have started with a small, and by small I mean book reviews. The advantage of book reviews is that you can shoot two birds with one stone, actually. Firstly, you can expand your knowledge, because by reading a book and preparing notes in order to review the paper, you add to the body of your knowledge about the field of your interest. And secondly, you write and publish a book review. So it's very important to start with book reviews. And the important thing about book reviews is that book reviews are achievable and rewarding. I think the first goal that you need to consider is to get your name in the journals. And this would be very rewarding. And this would have a positive feedback for you and somehow create self-confidence in you once you have, been able to publish book reviews. Once you get a couple of book reviews, of course, there is no limit to writing book reviews. Even nowadays, we write book reviews, and even some very, established researchers in our field, you might have seen that they write book reviews because, as I mentioned, we have to read books. We need to update our knowledge by reading, recently published materials. And so when we are reading a book, why not taking, notes and therefore preparing a book review to publish? However, I would say that perhaps a prerequisite for the next steps in the process of, getting published in journals is to write book reviews. And once you have done or acquired some experience of writing book reviews, then you are in a good position to write a review paper. So how do we publish review papers? What is a review paper in the first instance? A review paper, as you know, critically reviews the current publications on a topic or area of research and presents what is known, how it has come to be known, which relates to the methodology that other researchers have used, and what are the potential challenges and problems as relates to that specific area of research, and what needs to be done, the future steps. So in the review papers, not only we talk about what has come to be known and the methodology that we have used in order to come to know these materials, but also we raise some challenges and problems that researchers have been facing when they have been investigating, these issues. And finally, usually we put forth some suggestions as what researchers actually can do in the future. The core of the literature review usually is chapter 2 of the thesis. So in chapter 2 of the thesis, what PhD students do or master's students do is that they try to critically review the current publications on a specific area in their field and identify the challenges and problems and issues. So if you are able to publish a review paper from your literature review chapter, which is a good thing to do, and I encourage you and urge you actually to consider that, then you can be rather sure that you are on the track with research and writing. Because remember that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, and as I will reiterate it towards the end of the webinar, we need to gain experience. We need to accumulate experience and go through the process. And through review papers, we make new points. This is very important because we said that the key issue in writing papers is to make points, to produce new arguments, to propose, a new knowledge, propositions. Okay. Now, how to make a point? In order to be able to make a point, you need to read a lot on topics of your interest and know the field. So this is very important. And when you read the articles written by other researchers, you extract the main arguments by other researchers. So it's very important when reading any article to find out what's the main points or the main arguments that this researcher actually is, communicating with others. And you can plan for new research based on what you find from the previous research in order to make your own points. The bottom line is that to be a good researcher and a good writer, you need to be a good reader. It's my observations that sometimes higher degree research students, including master students and PhD students, they actually do not read enough. And this is unfortunate because we might think that we know, things, but this is not true. There is a lot that we don't know, and we all the time need actually to read and deepen our understanding of different, issues and phenomena. In other words, you need to become a scholar. I would like this word actually, before you become a researcher. As you will see, there are some scholars that they criticize PhD students who hasten and rush in to become researchers without developing, adequate body of knowledge or scholarship on the area and the field that they are working on. So what is needed is that you need to know fully about your topic and your area and your field. How can you test that? If you are able actually to talk about the field and the issues and the methodologies and the outcomes, then this means that you have been able to consolidate your understanding of the topic and the main arguments in that. So the third tip that I'm making in this webinar is I would encourage you to become scholars before you become researchers. And I have borrowed this actually from Booth and Bailey. Booth and Bailey published a very nice paper, which I have provided the reference for you to certainly get the paper after this webinar and start reading it. And the title of this article is Scholars Before Researchers, which means we need to become scholars before we start and embark on research. And they emphasize on the centrality of the dissertation literature review in research preparation. This article has been published in Educational Researcher, and therefore you can access it, and this is the reference for it. Let's see some of the main points that Booth and Bailey make in their paper. Firstly, they tell us that we need to be able to analyze and synthesize the research in the field of specialization to acquire the skills and knowledge required to be scholars. So in order to become a scholar, we need to not only read a lot, but also we need to analyze what other researchers and scholars are telling us in their papers. And then we need to extract the main arguments and points and try to synthesize them so that we can get a holistic perspective of the topic under discussion. They also say that a thorough, sophisticated literature review is the foundation and inspiration for substantial and useful research. So a sound literature review is very important. And this is why a whole chapter in the master's and PhD thesis actually is devoted to literature review. It's not just a chapter for decoration. It's not, an individual and separate chapter. It's an organic chapter in the thesis, as I will mention actually how it relates to the previous chapters and the later chapter in the thesis. Such a scholarship, Booth and Bailey actually say, is a prerequisite for increased methodological sophistication and for improving the usefulness of research. Because through literature review, not only we become familiar with the content of the topic and area, but also we gain some understanding about the methodological orientation of the researchers, the type of research methods that they use and the arguments that they have for the use of those methods. And finally, Booth and Bailey suggest some criteria to evaluate the quality of dissertation literature reviews, and they report a study that examined dissertations at 3 universities. So again, I would say that actually their criteria is very useful for individual PhD and master's students to judge about their own literature review, but also we usually use these criteria when we examine PhD theses, when we are invited to examine them from different universities across the globe. Okay. So what are some of the common mistakes about literature review? I emphasize on literature review because number one, as Booth and Bailey mentioned, actually, we need to become scholars and develop our understanding of the field before we embark on research, and number two, because a good literature review lends itself to review papers, and because in a plan for publication, after book reviews, review papers actually can be a target and a goal to achieve. Therefore, I emphasize on literature review and some of the common mistakes. These are some of common mistakes about literature review. Some people think that it's the easiest chapter to write. So as soon as you ask PhD students, what have you done? They typically say that they have completed the chapter of literature review. Another common mistake is that it's a list of summaries. A did this, B did that, C did this. Okay, so paragraph by paragraph, that usually they start with the surname of the researchers, that Brown did this study in 1994, Beckman did this study in 2007, and so on and so forth. So this is not what is meant by a sound literature review. And also another common mistake is that usually it's believed that the chapter of literature review is a separate and independent chapter in the thesis and does not have a reverse and forward functions, whereas a literature review actually has an organic link with the whole research, let it be a thesis or a paper published in the journals, and therefore literature review is one of the core parts. It has a reverse function in the sense that it contextualizes your research. By reviewing the literature, you tell your readers actually in which area you are doing research, and therefore you create a research space in that you link your topic with the previous studies, and then you come up with some niches and gaps that you are going to fill through your research. And also the literature review has a forward function in the sense that it provides material for the discussion of your results in your research. So as such, it's very important to conduct a sound literature review. And so the way that we can conduct a decent literature review is to consider it as a research project itself, although it is considered as a secondary research, but still it is, research. And since it is research, therefore, we need to search into major databases. Remember that we are now living at a time that we have access to very useful, databases. It's different from 20, 30 years ago that people actually had to go to libraries and search for the materials manually. But nowadays, it's very easy to conduct systematic search in databases like Linguistic and Language Behavior Abstracts, for example, or Educational Research Index Center, ERIC, or many other databases that might be related to our field of study. And we need actually to identify key concepts and theoretical orientations and methodological orientations and main conclusions or arguments, and developing categories and themes to present and discuss in the literature review. One of the seminars and workshops that I usually present is on literature review, how to conduct a literature review. And although I have presented it in a couple of times in Iran, but I would be more than happy to repeat it if there is a need for that. And I can tell you that some papers are rejected with the comment that the researcher does not seem to be familiar with the main publications in this area. So I have seen this comment actually from some reviewers. And also a major or negative comment on many PhD theses is related to the chapter of literature review. Myself, a major comment that I usually provide to PhD students, regardless of which university actually they are studying in, is that I am critical with the way that they have conducted their literature review, because I'm trying to use Booth and Bailey criteria, and I try, of course, to be constructive and provide some constructive feedback to PhD students as how they can change, their literature review in a way that they can even publish, from them. So if we conduct a sound literature review, then the outcome of the literature review would be to identify what is currently known about the topic and its related issues, and what is missing. So one of the outcomes of the literature review is that we should be able to identify some gaps in the current body of the knowledge, or the niche as it is called. The other important aspect of a good literature review is that it provides a theoretical conceptualization of the research problem. And once we are able to contextualize our research problem based on the previous studies, then this will help us to formulate our research questions and research hypotheses as derived from such a conceptualization of the research problem. And the other important aspect of a good literature review is to discuss the methodological orientations of the previous studies and justify why we choose a particular methodology for the current study that we are designing and we are going to implement. And also a good literature review actually provides sources for the discussion section of the results, and therefore it has a forward function in the papers as well as in the thesis. And the other important outcome of the literature review is that if a literature review is done effectively and efficiently, then it is possible to write a review paper or even a state-of-the-art paper on that literature review and publish it as a stage in the process. Okay, so up to now, we have talked about what quality journals are. Usually they are judged by their impact factor and quartile. And secondly, we have mentioned that in order to publish in these journals, we need to focus on two major elements. One is research and the other one is writing. And we said that research and writing are intertwined or intertwined with each other, meaning that for a good paper to be written, we need to have a strong research, and a strong research actually needs to be translated in a good way and presentation. And then we said that through the process of publishing in journals, we need to start with a small, and by small we mentioned that we need to start with book reviews. And once we get our name there and we get used to writing and revising and being published in the journals, then we can move on and then think about writing review papers. And I emphasize the importance of review papers because I refer to Booth and Bailey as they criticize some PhD students that they rush into conducting research without having the backbone, the content backbone or the scholarship related to their topic, and therefore it's very important to be scholars before researchers, as the title of the paper actually was. At this stage, I would like to move on and then think about, because again, I assume that many of my audience are PhD students. So after writing book reviews and then perhaps writing and publishing review papers, then the next step would be to think about converting a thesis into a journal paper. The challenges facing PhD students to publish papers from their thesis is length. Number one is length. Number two is selectivity. Number three is data and analysis. And number four is writing style. I would urge you, and perhaps some of you know, that Chapter 6 in the APA Writing Style Manual talks about and discusses about how to convert your thesis into a journal article. So there are enough materials in that chapter that you can consult. but briefly I would refer to these challenges and how it might be possible to address, these challenges and therefore publish papers, from thesis. The first thing to consider is that a thesis is usually 200 pages or more, whereas a journal article is typically 25 to 30 pages, around 7,500 words. So it's a challenge to reduce 200 plus page document into a compact 25 to 30 pages journal article, and yet it is possible to do it with extreme care, and therefore you need to do the following. Keep the substance, but cut the extra details. These details are those that are important for thesis, because in the thesis you might not have that restriction, and therefore there are a lot of space for you to present many details, and it is required for a thesis to be as detailed as possible. But for a paper, some of these details actually might be irrelevant for the journal article. So it would be wrong and a mistake to think about cut and paste. So transforming a thesis into a journal paper is not actually a matter of cutting and pasting. You need to select and rewrite. So this means that you need to come up with drafts of papers and then revise and rewrite in order. If you remember, I told you that journal articles have their own structure and genre, and therefore it's very important to consider those structures and genre, and therefore rewrite the drafts of the papers to make them appropriate for the journals. So the second challenge would be selectivity. What should we select from a thesis? A thesis usually covers several distinct research dimensions. In a journal article, you may want to narrow the focus to a specific topic or dimension to be selective of what to report. You might have come across 10 different, results and, findings. There is no need to report all of them in a paper to a journal. See which one has the highest level of contribution that you think is important to communicate with other people, and therefore you need to be selective. I know that sometimes it's very important, if not all the time, but this is something that we need actually to do, to use a trade-off, strategy, selecting some at the expense of leaving out, the others. In a thesis, you report everything, all the results. In a journal article, you try to bring the results under control by selecting which results to report, as I mentioned. Even in a thesis, sometimes I have seen that researchers put some of the results in the appendix and therefore refer their readers and examiners to the appendix, because it's not possible to report all of those in the body of the thesis. A thesis includes a lot of definitional and descriptive, sections. Although personally, I'm critical with the definitions and descriptions in the thesis, because I think what we should see in the thesis should be all, critical reviews and critical points. But still, it's a practice that we have a lot of definitions and descriptions in the thesis. In a journal article, you need to present a concise critical review and explanation suitable for the journal readership. So every word counts in the journal article, and given that journal articles are limited by the total number of words, usually between 6,000 and 10,000, therefore, you need to be very precise and concise in each section of the paper. A thesis includes a whole chapter devoted to literature review. You need to be selective in a journal article, given the word limit again, and therefore choose the salient resources that you want to include in the literature review section of the journal. So you need to be selective in terms of the literature review, in terms of the discussions and reviews of the previous studies, in terms of the level of details that you provide, and also the results that you would like to share, with readers. As it comes to the data and analysis, we can use the metaphor of lean meat, no superfluous fat. So think of meat without fat. So leave aside all the fat, all those fatty sections of the thesis. In the thesis, there are a lot of data and a variety of analysis. It is naive to import all of those data and analysis into a journal article. Use only the data and analysis that are relevant to your focus research problem and research questions, which needs to be worked out very carefully so that you have a direction and focus in the article. And compared with the thesis, a journal article has a tighter theoretical framework. So as I mentioned before, you might have actually a chapter of literature review, but in the thesis, it needs to be very concise. A succinct review of literature, a more controlled presentation of methodology, and a more focused data and analysis. And all of these means, drafting and revising. And therefore, it would be a mistake if you just cut and paste parts from your thesis into the article. Okay. So this brings me to the fourth tip. The fourth tip is that you need to start early and write and revise a lot. At least a 2-year plan for a full-length article. So again, it's unfortunate that sometimes we see some PhD students who would like to publish their paper in the last quarter of their PhD candidacy, which is too late actually. Since I know that in some of the universities publishing 1 or 2 papers is a requirement for the PhD viva, therefore it's very important that you think early in this stage. And as I mentioned before, because it is possible actually to publish review papers from the chapter of literature review, therefore it's very important to plan your work so that you can perhaps publish 1 paper from the chapter literature review and 1 paper from some of the most important results that you get from from your research. And it's wise actually to try short reports first. I know that many journals actually have got or provided a section to short reports, and therefore it's a good idea. Usually these short reports are not as strict as full-length articles, and therefore it is possible to get published. The other tip for you is try Q3 and Q4 journals. A Q3 and Q4 journal does not necessarily mean that they are inferior to Q1 and Q2. And this is something that actually we need to increase our literacy about. Not only our own literacy, but also some decision makers, literacy, that Q3 and Q4 journals, sometimes they can have a different purpose and audience. So some of these Q3 and Q4 journals target professionals and practitioners. So think about, for example, English language teaching in our field. The purpose and the audience of English language teaching is different from applied linguistics, for example, or from language testing, or from the modern language journal. And therefore, publishing papers in ELT does not mean that it is inferior actually to those journals which have higher impact factors, or might have actually higher quartiles. So this is another possibility of thinking about publishing in Q3 and Q4 journals. And the other tip is make sure that you follow guidelines to contributors and that there are not silly mistakes. It would be really silly to have lexicogrammatical errors or style errors. The message to the editors and the reviewers when they read an article with these types of errors is that if you are careless with these basic requirements, how much care have you put in the research? So it gives them a good excuse actually to reject it on the spot. So the other tip for you is to make sure that there are no such silly mistakes. Not only that there are not any of these silly mistakes, but also they are read fluently and lucidly. And this means that you need to read it several times and make necessary revisions and editing, but also having a colleague and a more experienced person to read and provide you with feedback. And that's a very good strategy to ensure that you get higher chances of getting published in the journals. As it comes to the presentation and writing, in addition to strictly avoiding spelling and grammatical errors, I would suggest that you need to strive for clarity. Clarity is very important. Get rid of unclear concepts and expressions. Do not say anything that you do not understand it yourself. And this is a very good check actually. Make sure that you understand every word that you put on the paper. Make sure that any claim in the paper has an evidence for it, a citation for it. So do not make unwarranted claims in the paper, and do not say something that is not clear to you, let alone to be clear to other people. Avoid excessive reporting and repetition. Actually, I'm now examining a PhD thesis from Malaysia, from one of the universities in Malaysia. And one of the comments that I'm providing is that I'm bored with this level of repetition. It is said that things should be clear and detailed in a PhD thesis, but when I see the same point repeated over and over in subsequent pages, then this would be something that we get bored with. So it's very important to avoid excessive and unnecessary repetition. We need to be very concise and up to the point in reporting in the journal articles. Be explicit, but not overly detailed. Certainly being explicit is important, but it does not mean that you have to be, overly detailed. Use the passive and active voice appropriately. Again, I can see that sometimes there is a phobia with using active voice, and therefore passive voice is used extensively, and even where the researchers actually can have their own voice and express their voice, they prefer not to use it. This is a common practice in sciences and engineering to use active voice, but in social sciences and humanities we can actually use both passive and active voice properly in different parts of the paper. And the other important thing is that you need to use meta-discourse meta-discoursal devices to communicate with your reader. And I refer you to a very useful article by Ken Hyland, which some of you might be actually familiar with, published in 2005, and the title is Stance and Engagement. And he provides a model of interaction in academic discourse. This article has been published in Discourse Studies, and it is accessible. Briefly, a stance is how you can express yourself in the paper, and therefore finding your own position in the paper. How would you try to position yourself in the paper refers to the stance that actually you develop. And engagement refers how you engage with your readers. And Hyland has provided some examples and also some discoursal devices that you can use in order to use appropriate stance and engagement in a paper, and therefore making your paper more communicative and understandable, not only for yourself but also for your readers. In addition to those tips, again, you might be familiar with some of these sources. I would urge you to regularly use these sources. One of these sources is Purdue University Online Writing Lab, OWL, Online Writing Lab. And if you have not checked this, or if you have not actually seen this before, then I would actually encourage you to use it regularly because this online writing lab, OWL, provides very useful, materials and tips and instructions and guidelines for writing papers. So, for example, we have materials related to general writing, we have materials related to research and citation, we have materials related to teacher and tutor resources, subject-specific writing, job searching writing, English as a second language, and some explanations about the online writing lab. And down the page you can see actually that we have got MLA guideline and APA guides and Chicago guide and so on and so forth. So there are very, very useful materials in Purdue University online writing lab. And you can see again here, for example, free resume template and free resume samples and formatting and builder, and so try to consult this and use it regularly. In addition to this resource, I have found actually this resource very useful. It is called PhraseBank. And this is developed by researchers and scholars at Manchester University. And the good thing about this academic phrase bank is that it provides, templates for different parts of, a paper. For example, if we're describing trends, if you click on that, then highlighting a trend in a table or chart, describing high and low points in figures, projecting trends, for example. When you want to explain causality, for example, again, verbs indicating causality, for example, then you can see, how these are used, and some of these actually are extracts from corpus of academic papers. And so when you want to compare and contrast, for example, introducing differences, again you can click on it, and then you can find some template sentences. X is different from Y in a number of aspects, and then you can continue writing, the paragraph. Or Jones 2013 found dramatic differences in the rate of decline of X between Y and Z. So these are, some template sentences that you can adapt and adjust with your research paper and use them, wisely and cleverly. And the other one is Phrasium, which is not as perhaps useful as the previous two, resources, but still it's useful, especially at lower levels of writing. So, for example, here we have phrasal verbs and idioms in use. Here we have presentation, emails, and other online communication, arguments and debates. So you can start actually and going through some lessons in order to understand how to present, for example, arguments and debates and things like that. So these are some of the resources that I have found useful when you work on your drafts of papers. and therefore they can help you to find appropriate, wording and, expressions. Okay. Now, another important thing is to handle reviewers' comments and, feedback. When your paper is sent for review, this is a very good news because, as I mentioned before, there is a high percentage of rejection on the spot rejection or disk rejection as it is called. And when a paper is sent for review, then this means that you are survived the disk rejection, decision. The meaning of this is that the editors have found enough, substance in your paper that they have decided to send it for review. So this is a cause for, celebration, and therefore you can be happy. When you get a major revision, again, it's a very great news. I have sometimes seen, some novice researchers and writers that they get disappointed with the decision of major revision. But we still get, major revision decisions when we submit papers, to the journals. Major revisions, again, is another good news because it means that the editors and the reviewers have not rejected your paper. They are interested in your research and would like to see it published. However, they have some concerns and suggestions for you in order to make the paper, publishable. The other point in handling reviewers' comments is that never you should be defensive in responding to the reviewers' comments and feedback. What does it mean to be defensive? Trying to say that the reviewer is, mistaken, and the point that they are making is, senseless. No, never do that. Try to take on board all of the comments and feedback and clearly say what you have done with regard to each of, those individual comments. And usually what we do is that we prepare a table in that we copy the comment and the feedback from the reviewer, and then we provide a response as how we have taken on board in the paper. Even if you get a rejection decision based on reviewers' comments and feedback, don't get disappointed, because this can be an opportunity for you. You can build up an opportunity by revising the paper and submitting it to, another journal. So all of these are, important issues to consider when you handle, reviewers' comments and feedback. And this brings me to the fifth tip, that you need to work with coaches and mentors. Coaches and mentors are those who have more experience in, doing research and publishing in the journals. The immediate community of coaches and mentors are your supervisors. And then if you develop a research network, then you can find other coaches and, mentors from other universities. But it's very important actually not to work alone, because as I mentioned before, it's very challenging to get published in journals and in quality journals. And therefore, this is not possible without the help and support from, coaches and, mentors. You need to work with masters, those who have already mastered their, the knowledge and the skills of, publishing in the journals. And I like actually the metaphor of apprenticeship. And therefore, you need to, go through the apprenticeship process and develop your knowledge, skills, and abilities by working with more experienced members of your discourse community. And all of us have already been through this process by working with more experienced, members of the field and discipline, and therefore learning from them how they handle, their writing and publishing papers in the journals. Okay. Now let's move on and see what possibilities are available for us in terms of, the journals. I have provided you with some references that you can use when you want to choose the journals in which you would like to publish. Blizzard Cloudiston, who was one of my PhD, friends when I was studying at the University of Toronto, has published a list of 962 periodicals, including journals, magazines, and other publications related to applied linguistics and TESOL and related fields. I have provided the reference for all of these at the end of today's presentation, and therefore you can you can know where to find them. As we can see, actually 962 periodicals is huge, is a enormous number of periodicals. However, not all of them are journals. As we can see, some of them are magazines. And not all of the journals are may not be quality journals, and therefore you can just use it as a reference. And sometimes it might not be bad to publish in some of them with certain, goals, but you need to be selective and choose the journals, strategically if you want to use this list. On the other hand, the Egbert has used, some criteria and collected data from TESOL and applied linguistics, professionals. And then she suggested 7 journals included applied linguistics, English language teaching journal, Journal of No Second Language Writing, Language Learning, Modern Language, Journal Studies in Second Language Acquisition, and TESOL Quarterly. Of course, these journals are very hard to publish in nowadays, but I think the rest of the list that Egbert referred to might be a possibility to consider. I like Renandai's, some of you might know Renandai, who is from Singapore, and he has done a lot of research in the area of language teaching and learning. But he has published a paper with the title of Choosing the Right International Journal in TESOL and in Applied Linguistics. And so his paper, I think it's very useful to consult because it provides a plausible list of, potential journals. And again, in addition to this, TESOL Convention and Exhibition in 2015 in Toronto provided a list of 52 journals related to applied linguistics and TESOL. And this list is titled How to Get Published in TESOL and Applied Linguistics Serials, which is very useful because not only they provide the title of the journals, but also they provide a summary and the scope of the journal, and therefore it's possible to make a comparisons and therefore decide which journals actually to shortlist and to put on your list. You need to add to the above list a list of internal or domestic journals. I know that there are now several quality journals published in our country, in Iran, and these domestic journals are even indexed in the Scopus and in other databases. One example is Journal of Research in Applied Linguistics, which is published as Shahid Shamran University in Ahvaz, and Dr. Jalifar, I assume, is the editor actually of the journal. And there are a couple of others that unfortunately the screen is not clear here, but there is one also published in Urumia, a publication of Urumia University and edited by Dr. Sadeghi, I assume, and there is another one, Iranian Journal of Applied Linguistics by Dr. Atayi, and there is another one by Shiraz University, and other universities actually have domestic journals, which are very good journals, and they have a good review process, and therefore it's good to think about, publishing in journals. But these are, potential lists of journals that you can read and think about, and then select a journal strategically. So what you need to do in order to select a journal strategically is that make sure that they are indexed in, some of those databases that we refer to, and therefore they could be categorized with, quartiles, even if they are Q3 or Q4. And also look for quality domestic journals, as I mentioned, index in ISC, if I use it correctly. And choose a journal with appropriate scope and, audience. This is very important because one of the reasons for, desk rejection is that sometimes papers are submitted to some journals that do not match, with the content and the scope of the journal. And this brings me to the final tip. All you need to do actually is to develop a research and writing plan, because I said that publishing in quality journals is a long-term plan, and therefore you need to prepare a 3 to 5 year research and writing plan with a specific milestones. And these milestones should be when to publish book reviews. So you might actually prepare a table in that you can identify for yourself that over the next 2 years, I'm going to publish 2 or 3 book reviews, for example. And then when to publish, prepare and publish a review paper, because I mentioned that you need to invest in your PhD or master's research wisely. Therefore, you need to make sure that you get something out of your chapter of literature review. Do not do just literature review for the sake of literature review, but try to get something out of it. And one of the outcomes could be a review paper that you can extract from. So, and you need to plan for that. So you might actually plan that, okay, over the next 2 years, I'm going to publish 1 or 2 review papers from my literature review. You need to decide about when to plan for, conduct, and report new research. So in addition to your PhD, you might want to embark on parallel or new research with some specific purposes. And also it's very important to develop some strategies for working with collaborators and more experienced members, mentors, and coaches, as I mentioned before. What is important is that you need to have this 3 to 5 year research and writing plan. And of course there would be some possibilities for revising this plan, but unless you prepare this plan, it would be hard to think about publishing in the journals. You need to plan your work and work out your plan. This is very important. And as you go through the process, you can actually reflect on your plan at the specific steps in the process, and therefore revise your plan when necessary and when it's appropriate. Okay. Now, my final tip is that a research and writing plan needs to include book reviews, shooting 2 birds with 1 stone, as I mentioned before. In order to become a scholar, we need to read a lot, other people's research as well as books, and therefore getting something out of reading books, which would be book reviews. Changing the chapter of literature review into a review papers and publish it, and this would be a good index of quality of your writing. Convert your thesis into a journal article, so you can publish short reports as well as full-length articles in local journals, in Q3, Q4 journals. And also we can use your experience and plan for publishing in Q1 and Q2 journals. In other words, you need to develop experience before you get to more challenging objectives. You need to do those that are more manageable in the first instance. So focus on research and writing plan. It's hard to master in short term, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, but it needs to be developed in long term. It is incremental and accumulative. If you look around and you look at your professors and more experienced members of the community, all of these people actually have gone through this process, and therefore they have, gradually and step by step developed, these skills and have accumulated experience of publishing in quality journals. It is indeed achievable through perseverance and not getting, disappointed, but developing, experience, building up even on rejections and, reviewers, feedback. Thank you very much for your listening, and I hope that you find these materials and tips useful. And I hope that you will be able to prepare your 3 to 5 year work plan and put your plan into action and continuously reviewing and revising it if it's necessary. And now I am happy to accommodate some of your feedback and questions if there are any. I think Professor Jalilifar will coordinate the questions.
Dr. Riazi, do you have my voice?
I do have, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, which I hope has come in quite handy to our participants in this webinar, because you provided us with the gamut of publishing, giving us hands-on tips and points concerning publishing in scholarly papers. It is true that the road to publishing, it is also true that the road to publishing is not comfortable, and crucially it is full of pits and holes, and those people who wish to try that road have to withstand, the uncomfort. There is a lot of expertise, yes, there is a lot of expertise, knowledge, awareness of what has gone in this literature, in this area that one, in the discipline that one wishes to publish. The prospects of publishing, knowledge and awareness of those generic and rhetorical structures. All in all, one who wishes to publish in scholarly journals should be fully familiar with the tricks of the trade. Well, I guess we can take a few questions. One of the participants raised the issue of whether it would be possible to publish a review article which is 2 or 3 years old now.
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually review articles need to be up to date because if it is 2 or 3 years old, then fortunately or unfortunately, knowledge and information in any discipline is increasing very rapidly. And therefore, it is said that every 2 years, actually, our knowledge get doubled in any discipline. And so if a review paper is 2 years old, there is a high chance that it misses most of the recent publications. So for sure it needs to be updated with what has been done. And this would be the type of review that if it is submitted to a journal, then it gets back with the comment that it needs to be updated with the new publications in this area, I assume.
to publish papers based on. Well, there is another question which I can see only the tail end of, and I missed it unfortunately. Papers based on their research conducted during their PhD studies. I guess, this guy is referring to those papers which are submitted to, classroom instructors as classroom projects. And, they are asking you whether there is a possibility or prospect of publishing these papers in scholarly journals.
I think there are two issues related actually to these types of journals, if I understand the question correctly. The first issue is that it needs to be framed within a research, framework. So whether it's, for example, an action research conducted by a research in order to intervene into an instruction or curriculum, and therefore would like to communicate with other, teachers and practitioners, or whether it's a research conducted by an outside, researcher. So in any case, whether it's an action research or, another type of research, it needs to fulfill the two criteria that I mentioned. One is that it needs to have a good research point and to communicate and a point to argue. And the other one is that it needs to have been written well and therefore have a good presentation to contribute to the field of the knowledge. But the other issue is that it needs actually to, I don't know the current situation in Iran, but certainly here and in other contexts, we need to have got ethics approval for any research conducted with the purpose of, getting published in the journals. So if this is the type of research that, for example, a master's or PhD student has done while they have been, studying in their program, they need to make sure that they have, consent from the participants, and therefore they fulfill the requirements of, the ethics, so that they can publish it. This is two comments that I can provide with regard to this question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, another question, it says, is it possible to write a book review for a book which has been published, which was published 3 or 4 years ago?
Oh yes, you might actually have seen that sometimes a book gets 3 to 5, reviews. So I can't actually see any problem of writing reviews on the books that have been published 3 even to 5 years ago, and even if they have already been reviewed. So you might choose another journal to, publish, the review of the book. So that's a possibility, because I have seen, and I'm sure that my colleagues have seen, that sometimes a book review is published in one journal. The same book actually gets another review published in another journal. So yes, that's a possibility. If you think that you have found some good points in that book that you would like to share with other readers, then yes, go ahead and write a book review and submit it to a journal. Yeah.
Yes, and one final question, Professor Riazi, which is directed to you, is whether an editor can publish in his own journal.
There is a possibility because usually papers undergo blind review or double blind review, in the sense that neither the reviewers nor the authors can identify, the author and the reviewer. However, I have seen actually that editors are reluctant in publishing in their journals because editors usually do the job of editing of a journal for most of the times for 3 years. So they prefer to publish in other journals. So in principle, I can say yes. There is nothing that prevents editors, from publishing papers in their journals, but I have seen a personal preference that they prefer to publish in other journals while they are editing a journal and then publish in the journal once they are not editing the journal.
Well, there is also another question which comes. Yes, it says, don't you think that publishing is not only reading and knowledge, but also personality?
I need to interpret this question because I don't exactly understand the question. But if I interpret the question in this way, that we need to develop a personality or a character that is in favor of publishing papers, yes, and this is what I refer to as having a passion for contributing to the field of knowledge. So unless we develop that passion in ourselves, then it would be hard to publish something on issues related to that field. So this is one interpretation of what the colleague or the friend who raised the question. So by personality, if we mean character or motivation, then yes, certainly we need that. But I don't know whether you, Professor Jalli, can have another interpretation of what the question might mean so that I can answer that interpretation as well.
No. Well, I prefer to remain silent on this. Because there are other questions coming up, and I would like to raise those questions. I thought, well, I was going to wrap it up, but, well, I guess there are some good, solid questions that are coming up, and I would like to raise them. One of them says, well, local journals...
I'm happy. Yeah. I'm happy.
Thank you. They say local journals do not go through double-blind reviews, but they go through names and the popularity of the authors.
So that's a bad thing, or unfortunate, or it's a shame actually to know that I'm not able actually to approve this claim or a statement. As far as I know, some of the journals, I understand, and I'm actually on the editorial board of some of these journals. I have seen that the papers go under review, and usually they follow the double-blind review process, which is common in most of the journals. But if there is a journal that does not follow this, procedure, then it's indeed unfortunate because, I wouldn't approve, and I'm not sure if my colleagues actually approve that it's it follows this policy that rather than sending the articles for review, they just focus on the names and giving credit to names. No, I wouldn't recommend that.
Mm-hmm. Well, another person has raised this question of, journal IFs in humanities, he says, or she says, well, in science we have, journals enjoying, an IF of 30. Why not having, such IFs in humanities?
Yeah, that's a good question actually, and something that we have been discussing here as well. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that In humanities and social sciences, usually book chapters, conference papers, papers in the conference proceedings, and edited volumes and monographs and co-authored books are more popular than in sciences and engineering. So, in other words, researchers in humanities and social sciences invest time into these types of publications in addition to journal articles. Because of this, the rate of publications in the journals is not as many as in sciences and engineering. My observation is that in sciences, especially, and in engineering, from the very beginning, supervisors and their PhD students start to, publish, and you might know actually that thesis by publication is very, very common in sciences and in engineering. Thesis by publication is that rather than writing the traditional and conventional 5-chapter thesis, usually a thesis is composed of 4 or 5, published papers or publishable papers that they work on. Another reason is that in sciences and engineering, the nature of their disciplines lend themselves to setting up experiments and therefore coming up with results very quickly. So in any field, in biology, for example, in physics, in chemistry, and IT and other areas, usually it's the case that they can set up an experiment and get some results in 2 months, and therefore write papers and submit the papers. The other reason is that there are many journals in sciences and engineering, and you might get surprised actually to know that most of these journals are bi-monthly, and so the rate of publishing papers is very high for humanities and for sciences and engineering. And since many papers get published very quickly, and there are lots of journals, therefore we can expect that the rate of citations go very high, and therefore this rate of citations will result in higher impact factors, and therefore, yes, you are right that sometimes we can see journals with an impact factor of 25 and 30. But this is not the case in social sciences and humanities. You might know that, as I mentioned, actually, you would be very lucky if you get your paper published over 2 years. Sometimes it might take even up to 3 years, which is uncomparable to sciences and engineering, with the review process is very quick, and the decision which editors make with regard to papers also is very quick, and therefore they get published much quicker and faster than in humanities and social sciences. So I can say that there are several reasons why we have got journals with higher impact factors in sciences and engineering, but journals with lower impact factors in humanities and social sciences.
Well, thank you. Another person has raised the issue of the quality of indexes like ERIC and MLA.
I don't know if ERIC actually, provides quality indices like the ones that we see in JCR or SJR. They index the materials, so ERIC would be considered more as a database like LLBA. So we might see some journals and publications say that they are indexed in ERIC and LLBA, but I wouldn't consider that as an index of quality in that sense, as we usually use JCR and SJR.
exactly. Well, somebody quoted something from Highland saying that, well, to publish in journals, you need to be Beck's thick-skinned about rejection. So, what do you think?
Sorry, could you, I lost your voice. Could you repeat
Yes,
the second part of the question?
yeah,
I heard
yes,
from Highland then. What?
yes. Well, one of the participants has quoted something from Highland saying that you have to be Beck's thick-skinned about getting rejections.
Mhm.
So what do you think? I guess you answered this in your presentation.
I think so, but given that actually Highland is one of the key figures in academic writing, and he has also a lot of experience as editor of, several journals in our field. Therefore, what he says could be reliable, and therefore I wouldn't comment further on what he say.
Well, actually, sometimes, well, it has happened to us all that we submit to a journal and then you get on the spot rejection. But you never say die. You just try another journal, or you get feedback from the paper that has been rejected, the feedback that has been sent to you by the reviewers. Then you take it as a point of departure to submit it to another journal. I mean, you you get instruction from the review process. The review process is not something to be thrown away, but to invest on it for your paper to submit
Exactly.
elsewhere. Yes, it tells me that you have to be consistent. You never get disappointed upon getting rejections. Well, and I hope,
Exactly. You make opportunities.
yes. And I promised this to be the last question, Dr. Riazi. One of the participants, one of the participants says, well, don't you think that these journals, especially international journals, are biased towards non-natives? And so, if you're a native, you get immediate response and most probably immediate acceptance. But if you're non-native, so they're biased, and so they might have reservations in publishing your paper.
My answer and feedback to this question is yes and no. Yes, because we are all using English as an additional language, and therefore it's obvious that we might not be able to write as well as the native speakers of the language. And so our writing might actually suffer from some standards that might have been imposed by the native speakers of English. So this is the yes part of the answer, that if, as I mentioned before, a paper needs to meet higher standards of presentation and writing in order to get accepted by the journals. So obviously, if the language of the paper and the writing of the paper is not meeting the requirement of the journal, then it's obviously get rejected. Because, as I mentioned before, too many papers are being submitted to the journals, and therefore it's not possible to publish all of them, and therefore they look for some reasons in order to reject some of them.
Yes.
But the no part of my answer refers to that it doesn't matter, and I have seen actually that papers are rejected by those papers written by native speakers get rejected as well. And this is because I have reviewed lots of papers written by native speakers, and therefore I have raised question with regard to the arguments being put forward and the level of evidence that has been required, for those arguments. And so, from this perspective, I would say that it doesn't matter whether the paper is written by a native speaker of English or a second, language, researcher. In any case, if there is not a strong researcher, if there is not a well presentation, then it would be rejected. Doesn't matter who has written actually. So the implication of this would be that we know that good writing is part of it's necessary, but it's not enough. But it's one of the elements of the that increases the chance of getting published. Since we know that good writing matters and is important, the implication for us would be that we try to revise it as many times as possible. And also, before submitting, we give it to a more experienced person to provide us with feedback and some editing, suggestions. And nowadays, actually, I wouldn't recommend because it's costly. There are some, companies and editors that they can read the paper and provide editing suggestions at some, costs. But if there is no other way, then that might be, a possibility. And usually the journals, some of the journals themselves, actually, they have, editing, so desk help or support that, of course, they charge again, some money. Yeah, so this is my answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Professor Riazi. Thank you very much, all participants who spent time, being with us. I hope, all of you have taken enough from this presentation to be of help to you in the journey of publishing in scholarly journals. Thank you very much, Professor Riazi, for all the time and energy that you invested on this presentation for us. I personally enjoyed meeting you and listening to you again. I look forward to seeing you again, perhaps, I don't know, in person or here over the cyberspace. I wish you, be sound and safe, and I wish you, a good day for the rest of the day you have ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Jalifar, and it was a pleasure to be with you and with other friends who participated in this webinar, and I thank them all for listening to me and also raising interesting questions. And I wish you and all the other participants all the best, as you mentioned, and we hope that we meet either virtually or face-to-face at some time in the future.
All right. Thank you very much, and have a nice day. Have a nice day, everybody.
You too. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.